Okay, good morning. Let's go ahead and get started. So we are moving right along with the quarter and continuing to talk about small group communication, including membership and some of the roles that people have as part of a group. We'll be talking about the first major writing assignment for today. And then we'll also take some time today to go over more details about the different types of roles that people can have within different small groups. So we'll be going over that, reviewing some things from last class. As a reminder, today is the deadline to turn in your first quiz. Remember that quiz is taken on Canvas, again, it's open note and open book. And it covers the week 1 readings as well as the syllabus. I recommend having those tabs open or just having access to the readings as you're working through those. And after those quizzes are done, you should receive some feedback and results on those. So just know that that's coming up. I also have been adding attendance after class. Again, we'll do prompts and activities to calculate attendance. If anything's in error, please let me know, right? You receive attendance, you're here face-to-face or through Zoom. You can't come in either of those ways. Then you can watch the recording and complete the makeup assignment that's on the front page of Canvas in order to make up for those days as well. I know that some of you might be concerned or know folks who have had exposure to COVID, right? And if you're not able to come to class face-to-face or you test positive yourself, you're welcome to join us through Zoom. So I want to take a moment just to review a couple of the things that we went over last class. We discussed some details and things to know related to the class, group norms, and some of the ways that different group norms can be applied to small groups, right? So we thought about how there are kind of these unwritten rules and guidelines that impact the way people communicate, the different goals that members of a group might have, right? If you're part of a band and you're making music or preparing for a concert, or you're getting ready for a radio show, right? There's a lot of differences in how small groups might work together. A lot of folks mentioned using different channels such as Snapchat, group texting, and so on to communicate. And the brainstorming and work that you've done so far in participation is going to directly help you as you work on this first major writing assignment. As a reminder, right, the group norms can be both hard-coded and written, like a student handbook or a set of agreements that you have if you join something like an athletic team. It can also be unwritten rules, like everybody bringing in donuts for snacks to the group. Another key idea we went over last class, right, were these different categories of norms, again, based on how members of a group communicate wearing a mask versus the ways that members of a group try to reach some sort of goal or end product. So I also want to take some time at the beginning of class, again, to go over this first major assignment, to discuss group member roles and ways that things like status and trust can impact our group membership too. So to start out, I want to go over this group membership reflection assignment that's available on the front page of Canvas, and it will be due 2 weeks from today. So if you go to the front page of Canvas, you'll notice that at the end of the 3rd week, there's the group membership reflection assignment that's listed here. It should also show up if you go on the front page and you check under assignments. So this is essentially a short writing activity that again asks you to use and apply some of the things from the class. And it's a way to kind of test things about writing. I like to do a lower stakes writing assignment that will help you so that you get feedback and know things to work on as you get into a larger graded assignment for class. So what I have here is both the prompt that I'm asking you to do as well as the rubric, which is what I'll be using to grade. So for the prompt, right, we're applying some of the ideas from the class to a group that you're either currently a member of or have been a member of in the past. It could be something like a friend group, but I think it works better if it's something like a club or activity or organization that maybe has a specific goal. And as a reminder, right, it should ideally have somewhere between 3 and 8 people. It's okay if it goes a little bit higher than 8 people. Maybe you're part of a team, again, like track or volleyball, right, that has more people than that. But make sure it's at least 3, since just 2 people would not be technically a small group. So I'm asking you to do 2 pages, double spaced, times New Roman, standard font and margins. I have sort of 3 parts of the prompt that I'm asking you to work on. You can either number off your responses and use paragraphs to address each of those, or you can make it a continuous essay that doesn't number off. Either way, you should be using complete sentences and paragraphs as you're working through it. You need to include in-text citations, right? So Brown 2019, as you're working through. A common misconception, right, is that you need to include works or an in-text citation, whether or not you're paraphrasing or directly quoting, right? The rule of thumb is that if it's not something that's in common knowledge or your personal experience, right, then you need to include an in-text citation for that outside material. So for instance, if you were to talk about how there's 4 different types of group norms, right, that's not something that you came up with. And even though you're not directly quoting, you're still going to want to include an in-text citation. So for this assignment, right, you need to include those. I prefer APA, but you can use MLA or Chicago if you strongly prefer doing that. I really recommend the Purdue OWL. It's a great resource that shows you some of the ways that you can cite and integrate material. And later this week, I'll also show you a couple examples that can help with citing too. So for this assignment, I'm asking you to first look at how this small group communicates. So this is something that you've already started to brainstorm and think about for this box. So consider more than just the channels that they use, but also think about some of the norms, the ways that the communication might or might not be effective, and so on, right? So a bad response is our group uses Snapchat. A good response would be our group uses Snapchat. Through using Snapchat, we start to develop a lot of interaction norms. We are regularly posting photos of our games, our matchups, and we use that to keep each other updated. It's a great way for us to have this active and quick communication, but it does mean that it's difficult for us to keep an archive or trail of communication over time, right? So get into more details about how the small group communicates. The second thing I'm asking you to look at is your own role and membership within the group. So one thing we'll be talking about today is Feldman's self-perception inventory, which has 9 major categories of different types of group members. So you might be thinking about your own role and participation within the group, using examples like events and stories to help us to understand your own role within the group, right? So a bad example would be, I'm something like a team member. A good example would be, I consider myself to be a team member because as part of the philosophy club, I'm somebody that generally likes to listen and support the group. I don't necessarily have the most controversial ideas to bring to the table, but I do help the group work together in solving some major problems, right? And then lastly, and this is the most important part of the assignment, I want you to think about some of the strengths and weaknesses of how your small group communicates, right? Think about, for instance, the different goals of small group communication, some of the different norms, and so on. What works well and what doesn't. You might think back to the way that some members of your group don't always seem like they're pulling their weight. Maybe there's gaps in communication, frustration, or negative feelings that members of the group have. In any case, this is a way for you to help assess and think about what works and what doesn't within your group. In addition to that, right, I like to include a rubric that just tries to go over in as much detail as possible what I'm looking for and how I will be grading this assignment. Again, I grade on substance, structure, and style. Substance being the actual content of your essay, structure being the way that your essay is written and organized, and style being things like writing conventions, citations, and so on, right? So you should clearly explain and define your small group, explain how that group communicates, your role within that group, strengths and weaknesses of the group, including, again, good and rich details from your small group communication can be a really big help, right? The difference between an A paper and a B paper would be that an A paper includes really clear explanation of how your group communicates. Maybe you bring up an example of an event or meet or activity where your group works together. A B paper just says, well, our group has these elements of communication. It doesn't really go into as much detail with examples about how that group communicates. So again, examples from your small group, such as stories, even quotations, if you have them, is a really good way to work on that. Should be 2 pages, at least, double spaced. That does not include a separate works cited page. Introduction, conclusion, clear body points is a good idea. I really like the use of good topic sentences and road maps to outline the main ideas that you go over. And then try to avoid spelling and grammar mistakes. So my partner runs a nonprofit, right? And so she has to write a lot of grants. She has a great strategy and one that I really like when it comes to working through grammar and conventions. 24-hour strategy, right? Where you give yourself some time before the essay is done, maybe like a day or so. You print it out. You don't touch or think about it for a day. And then you come back to your printed typed version. And when you have a fresh pair of eyes, it's a lot easier to notice spelling and grammar mistakes, right? If you're working through the paper and you find that you're just noticing some grammar mistakes, right? You'll find more if you give yourself time away. Again, make sure you're using the in-text citations and the works cited, right? It's plagiarism to draw from an outside source without directly referencing those. I would much rather have a late paper than a paper that plagiarizes, right? Because at worst, plagiarism is a 0 on the assignment or 0 in the class. So those are some things to know kind of about the structure, the things that I'm looking for from this writing assignment. Again, it's only 2 pages. It's not going to be a whole lot of work, but it is a way for us to start to think about and use the things that we've been going over in the class so far. Again, you can access this rubric on Canvas, and you'll be turning in the assignment through Canvas as well, either a doc, docx, or PDF. Please don't send it as a Google Doc. The reason for that is that a Google Doc is not stable, right? You can edit or change or modify it after you've submitted it. One easy option if you use Google Docs is to download it, such as downloading it as a docx. Please don't use pages files. Those are kind of a pain to convert, and they oftentimes don't convert properly. So those are some things to know. Ordinarily, it was going to be due at the end of the 3rd week, so it's going to be due a week from this Sunday. But because we had a delayed start and all the snow days and stuff, I'm again extending that to Wednesday. So it'll be due on Wednesday, January 26th. That's 2 weeks from today. So the last thing to know, right, is I'm happy to look at rough drafts or outlines of this assignment. In fact, students who do well in the class are oftentimes students who send me drafts and are like, hey, what can I work on? And then I troubleshoot and work with them on those things. So if you're looking to do well in the assignment, you can do that. It's -5% for each day an assignment is late for unexcused reasons, right? You could also choose to use your get out of jail free card, which lets you turn it in up to a week late with no penalty. But be careful, because you do have some other assignments in the class. So if you want to spend it on this one, you can, but you might choose to wait and save it for later on in the course. Any questions related to this reflection assignment? Again, I like to be as clear as possible, and I've tried to provide some pretty good direction as to what you'll be writing about and organizing with this assignment. Okay. I'm sure that questions might come up as you're working through this assignment. So if you do end up having questions later, please let me know, and I'm happy to work with you on those questions and help you as you're working on this assignment. Again, it's only worth 150 points or 15% of your grade. So it's not a huge, scary assignment, but a way to help prepare you and get you some feedback from me that'll help for your later writing assignments. So building on that, I want to talk about Belden's self-perception inventory. That's going to be one of the things that I ask you to look at for this assignment as you consider your role. I was thinking about giving you like an actual quiz to fill out the self-perception inventory. The quiz is super, super long and probably tedious to get through. You're welcome to look at it on your own and complete the inventory if you'd like, if you're interested in figuring out what your role is. But the self-perception inventory is a way of thinking about the different types of roles, tasks that people specialize in, right? This is not a be-all, end-all, because depending on the group that you're a part of, right, your membership and the things that you do might look really different. For instance, maybe in one group, such as an athletic team on campus, you are like a senior member. You've been involved in it for a while. You're really a leader, right? And you're somebody that people look to for trust. But maybe in another group, you're pretty new. And so your role looks really different. For example, right, I was involved in speech and debate. I tended to be, a kind of co-coordinator because I had a leadership role, but I decided randomly in college to try out Model United Nations. It was kind of fun, but I was in a very different role there. I was more of a team worker because I was just starting out and trying to get my bearings. So this isn't necessarily what you will be in every group, but to suggest that within a group, there's these types of roles that tend to take shape. So I'm going to talk through these roles, and I am going to ask you to take some time to think about the roles that maybe make sense to you or that you've been a member of in the past in your own groups. So a plant, right? A plant is a sort of creative or thoughtful person that focuses on solving unique problems, right? These are people that generally are going to be presented with a difficult task and are trying to work on completing it. So for instance, if you're involved with an extracurricular on campus, again, I was involved in debate. Oftentimes we'd have trouble coming up with strategy and figuring out what arguments we wanted to raise on an issue. So a plant was somebody that was focused on developing those arguments and putting together a lot of ideas and brainstorming. So if you find yourself being a creative person that generates ideas and brings things to the table, that might be the role that best defines you. Another role is the resource investigator, right? So the resource investigator is the person that is creating a lot of networks and communication between members of the group, right? You think about the resource investigator as the person that is building bridges. And so this is the person that oftentimes is creating the opportunity for people to get to know each other, to understand, to work together, maybe to delegate people into groups, but they talk a lot and they bring a lot to the table. A co-coordinator, right? The co-coordinator is oftentimes somebody that finds themselves in a leadership position. They oftentimes will help delegate, right, or assign out smaller groups or tasks and help with making decisions. For instance, if you were involved in something like student council or you were class president, right, you were a co-coordinator. You not only had a leadership role yourself, but you were helping divide up tasks and figure out what to do. If you're, for instance, preparing for a band or a radio show, you might think about how a co-coordinator is creating the smaller groups in ways to complete something. A shaper, right? So the shaper is somebody who is really interested in overcoming and addressing difficult problems, right? So this is somebody that oftentimes is dealing with some unique challenges and developing sort of innovative and thoughtful solutions to deal with those, right? So kind of similar to the plant, but if the plant is focused on ideas, the shaper is focused more about tackling challenges. So if you found yourself, for instance, for group activities and classes, like the person that's primarily working on or putting together a group presentation or project, you're oftentimes the shaper. You're molding together and putting together what it is that your group is working on. The monitor evaluator, right? So you can think about this as kind of like a strategist or tactician, right? This is the person that's thinking about and weighing the different options and trying to find what solutions ultimately make the most sense. How many folks are familiar with the idea of playing devil's advocate? Yeah, so a lot of you, right? Playing devil's advocate is the idea that you take on an adversarial or disagreeing perspective because you want that perspective to be heard after. So for instance, right, if you're putting together a travel schedule, working with your coach, and you say, you know what, we are going to go to Oregon and then to Washington, maybe you play devil's advocate and say, what if we went to this competition instead? And we went down to California, right? Playing devil's advocate helps you to understand and develop the things that you care about by giving you an alternate perspective. One of the biggest problems that can happen in small groups, right, is groupthink. or groups that censor and don't share their real thoughts because they're more concerned with building relationships among groups, right? We talk about this more in conflict management. There's a lot of examples of small groups that have some disastrous consequences if they don't allow disagreeing perspectives to be heard. Team worker, right? So this is somebody who generally has their head down. A team worker is not somebody that stirs the pot or tries to create conflict, but is somebody that works on trying to build consensus and agreement between other people. In fact, oftentimes these are folks that put together things like a Google document or something else to try to figure out where everybody stands and to get people on the same page, right? Team worker is really concerned with making the group mesh and work together well. So sometimes they'll find themselves in a mediator role where they're managing conflict. And an implementer, right? So an implementer is the person who maybe takes some of the broader ideas and thoughts that come from somebody like a plant and puts them into action, right? So the implementer is very much about theory or ideas in practice. I've talked with a few of you who are involved with athletics, right? And you have a coach who maybe puts together a schedule for you or helps to direct a lot of the ways that you manage your classes and work day to day, right? They're putting together the ideas, they're putting together the schedule, and you as an implementer, right, are putting those things into action by going through your day based on that schedule. So an implementer is very much practically focused on taking these ideas and putting them out. Then a completer finisher, right? You could almost think about the completer finisher as something like an editor or something like a school paper or a journal, right? They're the person that's ultimately tasked with polishing, finessing, and developing the final product. Oftentimes, these are very detail-oriented people, right, that go through a lot of revision work. Oftentimes, people in leadership roles, especially leaders who delegate out responsibilities, are going to occupy this role too, right? They're really trying to monitor and track and make sure that what is produced at the end of the day is something quality. So maybe if you're working on a group presentation for a class, you assign somebody who at the end of it all is going to be the person that looks over everything, figures out typos and solves them and so on. And lastly is specialist, right? You can think about this. For instance, if you call somebody like a plumber or technician, right? You're calling somebody that comes in with a specific set of skills and areas that they really excel in that you're not super familiar with, right? For instance, in a class like this one, if suddenly the projector and the computer and all of that stopped working, I would call in a tech who would come in and be, as a specialist, an expert in that field. So a specialist is generally kind of an independent person, right? But they bring in unique skills and talents and are ready to contribute to the group based on their own skill set. So again, there are these 9 different types of roles, right? Plant resource investigator, co-coordinator, shaper, monitor, evaluator, team worker, implementer, leader, finisher, and specialist. Based on these, and as I was talking through them, you might think about which particularly stood out to you. And maybe you thought, hey, I have a lot in common with this one. So writer type, and we'll do this for attendance credit for today. Which of these roles you tend to find yourself in the most when you participate in small groups? We'll give you some time to think about and maybe explain how you find yourself in that role. Again, we'll be turning this in at the end of class. Make sure your name is on it. Maybe you use a separate sheet of paper. And Elena, you're welcome to use either the chat or to email it to me and type it up. Give you a couple more minutes on this. A few seconds, finish up what you're currently writing or working on. So here's what I'd like you to do now. I'd like you to find somebody else in the class that chose a different role than you. So you might take a moment to briefly check in and see what roles other people have. You can form a group of 3 if you'd like to. And what I'd like you to do is just take some time to share some of the differences that you and that person have in terms of your roles. So maybe you're a plant and you find somebody else that's a co-coordinator, and you talk about some of those differences and the ways that those differences play out within your group. So take some time to talk and to contrast some of the ways that you participate or find yourself as a member of the group. I'll ask a couple groups to share what they came up with as differences after that. So go ahead, maybe you look around, find somebody sitting near you, and figure out some of the roles that you all have. And Elena, since you're the only one on Zoom right now, you're welcome to compare to somebody that you know who's been involved in a group and see how you might be different than that person. So maybe there's a friend who you know is a different role than you. You might think about comparing those two. You know, a lot of times it's great ideas, but then we just have to pull together.
It's like going around like hearing everything.
Yeah, I like privilege. Yeah.
There you go. I don't know if I should. Yeah.
What are the roles you all found yourself
I chose 3 doors.
Okay, yeah.
How many people?
Okay. Yeah, I would imagine that like your amount of time that you're like. Probably physical.
I don't anymore.
Yeah. Right, and like seeing like the person that has the phone or like just ready to check in. Feel it.
My best friend.
Yeah. It's a good example of having that kind of role. It's interesting, like in the context of right? There might be like a lot of different specialists working together, right? It's interesting to see like not every group has one specialist. There might be a combination. Really have expertise in different areas. They have to come together. Maybe have some flashing. Definitely. So go ahead and take a minute or two to finish your discussion.
How long do you think this does take?
It's supposed to be around 20 minutes, but I think a lot of times you have to like send it to an expert who has to pay for it and all that. So yeah, there might be some ways to do it for free. You might just check like Melvin's self-censorship story. There's some options there. All right. So I'd love to hear from a couple groups about some of the different roles and some of the changes within those roles that you all noticed. So why don't we start here in the back with some really interesting ideas here about some of the different roles you all have. Would you like to speak to some of the roles you all found yourselves in?
For me, I said that I'm more of a seat worker. I just always been like someone who like getting everyone involved, just make sure everyone's ideas are heard, just like make sure like we're all working together so that they like whatever we're working on is like high standards. Like any sports or time and then more of a specialist. Because he has like special like training skills that can offer to the table. And then to do more of a
many people found themselves like entering in multiple roles? Yeah, so several of you, right? So one interesting thing to think about is why you find yourself in a different role depending on the group. Again, it could be the amount of time that you're in the group, your status or level of leadership in the group. Maybe you're an expert or specialist in one group, but you're pretty new or more of a team player in another. So I really like the way you all brought up some of the contrasting perspectives that you all have there. About this group in the back over here.
So the role I found myself in was team player, trying or team worker. I like trying to get people involved, make sure everyone gets talk about less conflict and stuff, kind of make sure the group works well together all the time. Kate said she was a computer finisher, very detail oriented, wants to make sure everything's perfect and looking good.
I know what the purpose is so close to
So
perfect.
wanted to make it look good. Track everything. Then Destiny was a co-coordinator. She seemed confident in what she's doing, and people look up to her to lead the group.
Yeah,
It's not intentional. But I don't, people are.
yeah, leadership falls onto you.
Yeah, pretty
Yeah.
much.
Yeah, but that's a good point though, right? Because oftentimes for folks that wrote multiple roles, right, depending on the group and the level of flexibility that the group members have, you might find yourself in a role that isn't your favorite, but is what you're willing to do in the situation, right? Like maybe you don't intend to be a leader, but because you have a lot of team members or consensus type people, you step up and you're like, okay, I'll lead the group, right? I really enjoyed you all's discussion about this because thinking about your own role and participation in the group and the way that those different types of roles fit in helps us to understand that like flexibility matters a lot, but also that depending on the group and its goals, there's different types of roles that might be seen as more or less important. We'll talk more about culture on Friday, but one example, right, is that depending on the culture, in a more collectivist or group-oriented culture, there might be less focus on somebody like a specialist or somebody who works independently. There might be more value on something like a team member or consensus-based person. So the differences in the types of roles that are important or that are valued or sought in something like a job or group are definitely going to look pretty different too. So the brainstorming that you've done for today and some of the roles that you find yourselves in will be directly helpful as you're preparing and thinking about that short writing assignment we talked about earlier. So there's a few other things that I'd like to discuss to build on some of the points about group membership and some of the types of roles. Again, we'll pick up on more of these threads on Friday. One of the ideas here, right, is the idea of violating a group norm or group rule, right? So oftentimes, right, you join a group and there are unwritten rules or expectations the group has. So for instance, in my other class, there's a student who mentioned that when they are involved in sports, right, they don't take off their shoes or they don't like change out of their athletic clothes until the coach comes in. And then that's kind of a shared practice, like the coach sort of releases them. And so violating, right, or going against the group norm can be a problem. So if you go against the expectations or goals of the group, one major problem, right, is a loss of influence. So if you're somebody like a class clown or joker type person who is just cracking jokes and using humor and interrupting the conversation, keeping people from working together, or you're like gossiping or changing the subject, right? Over time, people are going to take you less seriously as part of the group. You lose attention and credibility because people don't count on you anymore. Another issue, right, is ostracism or just kind of feeling like you're isolated from the group. You're not participating, you're not on the same page for working together, and then being excluded, right, where maybe you just are no longer included or brought into future meetings. So sometimes you find yourself as part of a group and you don't like the approach the group does. You don't agree with everything that they say or do. If you find yourself in more of a co-coordinator or leadership role, maybe you say, I don't like this, this is inefficient, I think there's a way to change that, right? There are constructive ways to change and modify group norms over time too. So when you're trying to figure out or maybe change the way that the group is structured or organized, there's a lot of different approaches you can take. Maybe, for instance, you join something like a student council or a leadership position on campus, and you find that the group does not work very well. They don't communicate, they don't take notes, they don't manage the group in a very good way. Some of the ways that you can deal with that and maybe to change group norms. First of all, is to see if everybody is on the same page about what the group is designed to do, right? So for instance, the goal of our group is to make some changes to campus, including some of the food that we offer for meal plans, right? Maybe you say and clarify to the group that that is the end goal in an effort to help focus everybody. Another goal, right, is to see if everybody understands the group, including its purpose, in the same way. For instance, being a member of a group, you might say, look, our goal is in an hour to develop a new meal plan for campus. We're not trying to socialize. This isn't like a casual thing. It's focused on a solution. If you are changing a norm, right, or sort of a rule that a group has, you have what's called the burden of proof, right? It's on you to explain why that change needs to be made. For example, I was a member of a small group who met pretty regularly, but didn't take notes. I said that we should change that. We should have somebody that's taking notes and tracking minutes so that we can more clearly follow along and refer back to them as the group communicates, right? Offering a plan. So if you want to change a group, feel like your group isn't communicating very well, or there are changes you see to be made, having a plan and explaining how you get there is a good idea, right? One challenge that oftentimes happens in groups is if all you're doing is throwing out ideas and not really showing how they can be implemented, right? You're passing the buck over to other people to actually make those changes. So if all you're doing is generating ideas and not transitioning into a role of implementing those ideas, that could be a problem. You might also consider changing the structure of a group, right? So if you're a leader or team captain, one way that you could do that is to split people up. You know, a group of 8 people, maybe you have 2 teams of 4. So these are some ways you can think about group norms and sort of the appropriate ways to change and to modify them. I want to talk about a couple last things related to both trust as well as status. So if you think about why you probably join certain small groups, right? A big reason why is because you see trust or credibility among members of the groups, right? It's a good chance that status plays a pretty big role. So for instance, if you are good friends with somebody like a class president or captain of a sports team, right, and you know them, or you know that you have a really good coach at EOU, that oftentimes motivates you to join the group. You feel like it's run well, it has good leadership, you're very motivated to join. Status, again, could be somebody like class president, a senior speaker, right, or valedictorian who gives oftentimes a speech at the end of every academic year, right? It's somebody who has importance and plays a major role in that group structure and organization. And one thing that's important to think about is that if you're a leader in a group, right, you're going to find that you're communicating to that group really differently. One major reason is that you have privileged information. If you're a class president, you're going to work with folks, including the president of the college, and the provost, and other people, right, who give you access to information that not everybody has. You're also taken more seriously, right? People stop talking and pay attention to you if you have status and credibility. And you might speak more frequently, right? You might occupy more space in the discussion because you're helping to guide that discussion. It's also important, if you're navigating a small group, to know the status of members of the group, right? So if, for instance, the captain of your sports team is talking and you decide to talk over and interrupt them and speak out of turn, right? That's a much bigger faux pas and a much bigger problem than just interrupting another person on the team, right? So knowing status is really important because it can help to figure out some of the norms and the ways that power can impact that small group too. The role of status is something you can think about as you're thinking about your assignment and the way that group members participate. Another key idea here is trust. How many folks have ever done something like a trust fall before? Right? The idea that somebody like leans back, right? And somebody else will help to catch that person. Trust is another really big challenge in communication in small groups. You have to feel like you can count on other people. In fact, again, a major challenge that we find if we're using small groups for like presentations or class assignments is that we don't fully know or trust other people to get the work done on time or to stay on track, right? It's oftentimes a reason why we don't like working in small groups, that other people might let us down. So trust, right, is about things like integrity. Integrity is who are you when nobody's watching? The strength of that person. Can they get something done? Can they work effectively within that group as a whole? The ability, can that person finish the tasks? And dependability, can you reliably count on that person to resolve the issue? So when we're in small groups, right, you might be familiar with the phrase, we sink or swim together. We are taking a gamble on other people, trust and count on them, in the same way that we're leaning back in a trust fall for somebody to catch us, right? And that can oftentimes be a challenge. If you're working on, again, something like a sports team, and you know that somebody else occupies a different position than you, and you're throwing the ball to them, you need to make sure that they can catch it and that you can trust them. And the idea here is that trust is earned over time, right? It's something that you develop and cultivate as the group progresses and continues to talk with one another. There are some ways, right, that we can build trust. Directness matters a lot. Say what you mean what you say. Being open to changing your mind, right? I think one major problem in the US is that we treat changing your mind or your opinion as a sign of weakness. But changing your mind and saying, you know what, I was wrong before, I've learned from this, can be a good way that you can adapt to the group. Believing that other people can do well and succeed, right, can be really important, especially if you have a leadership or mentorship role. Being accountable, right, saying, hey, I didn't get this done, but I have a plan to work forward. Having a victor approach, right, where rather than saying, this happened, I was late, and then the train ran through the middle of town. And instead saying, look, I fell behind, but I know what I need to do to be a good strategy. And then taking responsibility, right? Owning up for the problems or issues that might impact you in the group. So again, we'll hit on some of these ideas a little bit more next class too. But to wrap up for today, we talked about some of the different roles and ways members of a group can work together. We've talked about the role of status and trust, and the ways that those can impact group participation. So again, your writing assignment reflection with the rubric and the prompt due 2 weeks from today on January 26th. The next class, we'll be talking more about group membership, including the role that culture and context plays in group relationships. So please email or pass forward to me the prompt that I asked you to do for attendance today. Make sure that your name is on it. And then have a great rest of your day, and I will see you again on Friday.